I wanted to make a quick video about Justin Martyr and the Trinity, and don't worry, I'm not going to get into all the arguments about whether or not Justin Martyr was a Trinitarian. That's something that a scholar of the Greek needs to handle, and Dan McClellan has an excellent video on the topic for those of you who are really wanting to check this out and get the Justin Martyr was not a Trinitarian view. I'm going to put a link to that video in the description down below, and you can go watch that. He'll do a much better job than I could. What I am going to do in this video, however, is I am going to present videos from Inspiring Philosophy from two different videos of his showing the shell game that Trinitarians often play trying to make Justin Martyr be a Trinitarian. I'm Steve Perry. This is Biblical Anarchy, and that's all I want to do in this video today. So we're not going to get into any actual arguments. We're just going to show the major flaws in their argument where they're shuffling things around to make Justin Martyr appear to be a Trinitarian. And if you pay close attention to what they're saying, they debunk themselves. So let's take a look.
You can say that maybe Justin used some imprecise language, but I would say we can't fault Justin for using language that only became problematic in the later Arian period. In Justin's time, this language just is perfectly normal for a Trinitarian to say.
These are two shell games here that get played. I'm just going to point both of them out. First off, the begging of the question, right? The reason why the question is important when it comes to Justin Martyr is because he wrote an apology, a defense of the Christian belief. So was he defending Trinitarianism? Because if so, then that's probably what the Christians of his day believed. What they do in this video is they presume the existence of Trinitarians who just spoke in a different way than later Trinitarians because the heresy of Arius hadn't arisen yet. But notice, Justin Martyr's language isn't problematic with Arius. It's only problematic with the Trinitarians. And that's where we get the second shift, the imprecise language, right? Well, they really were Trinitarians. They meant exactly what we're saying. He just was imprecise with his language, right? But he's writing a defense of his beliefs. Why would he be so casual and imprecise with his language? What if Justin Martyr meant precisely what he was saying? Then that would mean that he's not a Trinitarian, right? It's not imprecise language. He's writing what he believes. He just isn't a Trinitarian. Next clip.
So here's what Olson and Hull say. Still, even if Justin occasionally swerves off the path, his willingness to listen to the church at worship and its prayers, liturgies, and creedal confessions generally kept him moving in the right direction. In his first apology, he writes, we revere and worship him, the true God and the Son, who came from him and taught us these things, and the prophetic spirit. Justin seemed to realize that if the church worshiped Father, Son, and Spirit, a Trinitarian model of some kind must be forthcoming, and he provided important planks in its construction.
Now, here, Inspiring Philosophy is arguing that these scholars agree with him that Justin Martyr was a Trinitarian. I haven't read their book. Maybe they do, but this quote doesn't. And this quote shows exactly what's being done to make him a Trinitarian. Notice, it says that Justin occasionally swerves off the path. What path? What path is he swerving off of, right? But he kept moving in the right direction. In what direction is he moving? See, if we're saying, is Justin Martyr from Boston? Like, does he live in Boston? Well, he's on the path to Boston. He's moving in the direction of Boston. Then he's not a Bostonian, right? He's not there. He's on the way there. And it becomes even clearer later in the quote when it says he seemed to realize that if the church worshiped Father, Son, and Spirit, a Trinitarian model of some kind must be forthcoming. But the question is, was he a Trinitarian? Not was there a Trinitarian model forthcoming, and he provided important planks in its construction, right? Yes, nobody's disputing that at one time the church wasn't Trinitarian and that the thought began moving in a Trinitarian direction and eventually arrived at the Trinity. All of this is consistent with what folks like myself say about Justin Martyr, about Tertullian. Tertullian's closer to a Trinitarian than Justin Martyr, but neither one of them have gotten there yet. They are on the path, but this is a path to a destination that is a couple centuries away or a century away when it comes to Tertullian. Like, this is on down the line. They are not there yet. Okay, they're having to get there. They are providing planks. Yes, they are moving the theology away from the theology of the New Testament authors to a theology of Trinitarianism, what it would eventually become. That's not the dispute. The question is, was he a Trinitarian yet? And I would say that the answer is no. And it seems like these scholars that he's citing as backing up his point, they seem to also recognize that he's not there yet. Now he has another scholar that comes on with him to discuss a book about the Trinity. And here we're going to see, because he's answering a question that Inspiring Philosophy asked him in the email, and you can see exactly what's happening in his answer to the question. Let's go there.
Give an idea of people what the doctrine of the Trinity is, and maybe what it's not.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because you, when you emailed me, you kind of mentioned this question whether the pre-Nicene church fathers believed in the Trinity, and I was kind of thinking, depends a lot on what you mean by the Trinity or the doctrine of the Trinity.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, and that's, I think that's actually something that the definition of what is Trinitarianism, what counts as Trinitarian, is itself, I think, part of what's kind of at issue in some of these debates. So, like, a lot of people would just define Trinitarianism in some broad sense as like there's one God and three divine persons, and then just sort of however that works out, is kind of broadly Trinitarian. And that's, I mean, I take that, I would say, yeah, that's probably what people mean by Trinitarian. But then there's, you might say, well, more specifically, when we talk about the doctrine of the Trinity, we're talking about this doctrine that historically in the 4th century was debated between lots of different church fathers and different heretics and whatever, and kind of eventually was settled on, by the church by the end of the 4th century. And so you might say, well, so the doctrine of the Trinity is whatever is that view, right? So, I guess I would say there's you might have kind of a broad definition of Trinitarianism and sort of a more narrow definition.
Yeah.
See, and there's a last key step in the development, right? The broadening of the definition. So imprecise language, broader definitions, that allows us to say a lot of things that we couldn't otherwise say. And notice, he's tying it directly to the question, were these church writers like Justin Martyr, like Tertullian, Trinitarians? He's like, well, depends on how broadly we can define the term Trinity, right? That's my point. That's the point that folks like myself are making. You have to broaden the definition and speak of them as using imprecise language and jump through all these hoops to get them to be Trinitarians. Think of it like this. Today, we have vehicles on the road called sport utility vehicles. Before that, we had minivans. Before that, we had station wagons. Station wagons and minivans were called this because they weren't really a car and they weren't really a van. They were somewhere in between. But eventually the concept took off to where we had these things called sports utility vehicles. Now, you could argue that people who drove station wagons considered them to be a sports utility vehicle. They just used imprecise language. But if we broaden the definition out far enough, then station wagons and minivans could be sport utility vehicles, and they were just imprecise in the way they talked about them at the time. But we would never do that because it doesn't make any sense to expect people who drove a station wagon to call it a sport utility vehicle when there was no sport utility vehicle at the time. It is a different type of vehicle. But if we broaden the definition enough, we could get station wagons into that category. We could get minivans into that category. But the fact is, they were a category on their own, a step in the development from car to SUV, where we eventually arrived. So today we speak of SUVs. The people who drove station wagons didn't call them that at the time, and they didn't think of them in that way. They thought of them as a specific type of car, right? So this is what's happening in this conversation. You know, if we can say that Justin Martyr's language was just imprecise, and then we can broaden out the definition of the Trinity, well, yeah, then we could get a lot of people in there. But I'm not just desperately trying to defend the Trinitarian view. I want to know, was this the view of the New Testament authors? Was this the view of Justin Martyr? Was this the view of Tertullian? And if you presume that they were speaking precisely, that they actually meant what they said, and you don't broaden out the definition so far that pretty much everybody could be a Trinitarian, then no, they weren't Trinitarians. At least that's my opinion. What do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. Don't forget, if you want to dive further into this conversation, I'm going to link both of these videos from Inspiring Philosophy down below, and a video from Dan McClellan explaining how the Greek makes it even more clear that Justin Martyr was not a Trinitarian. Anyhow, if you enjoy this video, give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, subscribe to the channel, but whatever you do, don't just sit there, do something.